With the exception of a few minor raids, the Federated Sons had been out of the Third Succession War for 4 years by 2918. This had given the realm sufficient time to rest their forces, deal with the renegade brotherhoods, and shore up their faltering economy. Now they were in a better position than any other successor state, and ready to take the fight to their hated Kuritan enemy. The war along their Corwood border restarted in March, with 4 precision raids and a trio of larger invasions. The attacks met with much success, with Lima and Macomb falling to Davion within 3 months. Only on Kosa was the dragon able to deal enough damage to the invaders to make them pull back. More than 50 years had passed since the conclusion of the Shadow War within the Draconis Combine, and yet the rift between the head of state and the internal security force had never healed. The foolish pride of prior coordinators had prevented them from making any conciliatory actions that might put the matter to bed, but the recent success of the Federated Sons' invasion brought the futility of the situation into sharp relief. Shinjiro Kurita travelled to New Samarkand to address the graduates of Sunzang MechWarrior Academy, but while on planet, he would also meet with director Clarissa Indraha. What was only supposed to be a 3-week visit ended up dragging on for 6 months as the ISF aired their many grievances, but the coordinator was determined to reach a resolution. The intelligence agency wanted out from under the mustard soldiery, but Shinjiro was able to find a compromise. Henceforth, the director would have a place alongside the military district warlords on the High Council as an equal. Satisfied, the 2 parties signed the Davarapala Accords in 2921, reforging the close bond between them. The Capellan Confederation had also been enjoying a period of relative peace up until 2920. The last notable action along the Free Worlds League border had come back in 2912, but a quick flurry of raids began the new decade, most notably a 3-way tussle on St. Andre involving both the AFFS and FWLM. With the proven success of Amara, 2 new warrior houses were founded, Hiritsu and Kamata, swearing loyalty to the Chancellor as before. Otto Liao passed away around this time, but he had already abdicated in favour of his son Merlin 3 years earlier. The Armistice of Van Diemen kept Davion-Liao relations honest, with only a few border clashes worth mentioning. Tit-for-tat raids against Royalston and Spica took place in 2922. Then 3 years later, the Seacaf got a bloody nose when they struck Alcyone and Axton. Both attacks were driven off, achieving nothing but to remind the people of the Federated Sons that you can never turn your back on a Capellan. A full decade had passed since the Free Worlds League last made a serious effort to capture another system. Captain General Samuel Marek felt constrained by the Home Defence Act his aunt and predecessor had agreed to, worrying that the provinces might suddenly withdraw their support from any new campaign he launched. To mitigate this problem, he raised the Atrian Hussars in 2923, and they would play an important part in his conquest of Callison and Wing the next year. No less significant was his success in winning the contract of Smithson's Chinese bandits in 2926 after they left the service of House Steiner. On Samuel's opposite border, there were some minor raids back and forth in 2925. Marek dispatched another mercenary group 3 years later to keep Liao off balance, but the Captain General's attention lay elsewhere. The Fusiliers of Oriente were dispatched in 2928 to raid Solaris 7. The Lyran regulars in garrison falsely believed the target to be a water purification complex, and so had almost nothing present to defend the actual objective, a battlemech repair facility. Steiner's counterblow came quickly, sending a regiment to strike at the mining facilities on the provincial capital, Stuart. The attack was a disaster, and many soldiers were taken prisoner. Among them was Hauptmann Traitor Tertren, a minor noble from the Lyran Commonwealth. He had no desire to spend the rest of his life incarcerated, and so approached his captors with an offer. In exchange for his release, he would become an informant for the Freeworlds League. The scheme was approved by Sian-Marik, who ordered the prisoners freed soon after. Mikhail provided SAFE with a bounty of information on LCAF deployments, intelligence they used to launch a successful invasion of Shiloh in 2929. One of the keys to the FWLM's success on Callison and Shiloh these past 5 years had been the Liberation Units, a scheme concocted by the Assistant Deputy Director of SAFE. So-called dispossessed MechWarriors who had lost their mech were organised into bands of 50 to 100 and tasked with wreaking as much havoc as possible ahead of the main assault force's arrival. 6 more Liberation units were trained in subsequent years and transported to their destinations aboard merchant freighters. Hauptmann Tertren seemingly had no compunction about identifying other worlds where acts of terrorism could be used to destabilize Steiner control, paving the way for further conquest in the future. Coordinator Shinjiro Kurita passed away back in 2925, but had never named which of his children would succeed him. The choice fell to the military district warlords and their ISF counterpart. Unsurprisingly, their prejudices meant they skipped over his eldest daughter Nesses and selected the middle child Hugai instead, mostly because he was a decorated regimental commander, but partly because he was a man. Fortunately for the Draconis Combine, Nesses did not have the same vengeful personality as her distant relative Rowena, and had already found her purpose in life, the recovery of lost medical technology. In 2929, Hugai's attention was grabbed by reports of a build-up of Federated Suns forces on Exeter and Olancha. To ensure the realm was adequately defended, he dispatched 2 regiments of the Galadan regulars to a staging post on Kosa 7 in the charge of his former commander, Shosho Samson Sakamoto. Prince Imperial Peter Davion rose to the position of Field Marshal in 2928. He was just 29 years old and had already proven himself every bit as capable a military commander as his father. Unfortunately for him, he was given command over the entire Capellan March to keep him out of trouble. Ordinarily, this would have been an extremely prestigious position for one so young, but on account of the Armistice of Van Diemen, there was precious little for him to do. Davion military intelligence relayed to Peter that the Capellan Confederation armed forces had abandoned their doctrine of elastic defense. Though an effective strategy to hold territory in the face of a numerically superior foe, maintaining a permanent state of readiness had exhausted the CCAF and tied up transportation that was desperately needed elsewhere. Perhaps believing that they were no longer threatened along their Spinwood border, Chancellor Merlin Liao had ordered them to stand down. The Prince Imperial petitioned Joseph Davion for permission to launch an all-out invasion to take advantage of the situation. Delaying only gave their enemy more time to prepare, as evidenced by the founding of Warrior House Luthien in 2928. A Capellan raid on Lee in the first days of 2930 provided the justification the two needed to break the treaty. Operation Roland's Horn commenced immediately. The main thrust launched from Addix in January and was tasked with broadening the Terran corridor. 4 systems were captured with barely a shot fired, then Karwich and Nopa brought the total up to 6 after their garrison was defeated. The Capellan commanders had been told to avoid further combat losses at all costs, as the Confederation had almost completely lost the ability to construct new battle mechs. It was better for their careers to withdraw in the face of aggression, rather than fight it out and sustain damage. The second invasion path aimed to conquer the very last of the Chesterton commonality, and was led by Peter Davion himself. Only the new Hessen defenders were able to cling on long enough for reinforcements to arrive. This was the largest land grab for any successor state since the opening months of the war. While his son was off gallivanting in the Capellan Confederation, the first prince saw his chance to use the morass around the Terran corridor to launch an opportunistic attack against Cosa 7, a former Davion holding captured by the Draconis Combine long ago during the First Succession War. MWIO counterintelligence had the Kuritans fooled into believing that the military buildup they had witnessed was part of Operation Roland's Horn, and so when the AFFS arrived in February, they didn't even notice the threat. As a major supply hub, they were used to transport flotillas arriving at uncertain intervals. Once they did realize the approaching vessels were carrying more than just food, the alarm went out, and aerospace fighters rushed to meet them. Their FedSun's counterparts were far better prepared, however, and quickly won orbital superiority over the 7th planet. The armed forces of the Federated Suns brought 3 battlemech and 12 conventional regiments to secure the world, and Joseph Davion himself had come to lead the liberation, as was his wont. Opposing them were the new arrivals from the Galladon Regulars and 4 other conventional units. Believing that the landing site was secure, he disembarked from the command dropship just as a daring Kuritan airstrike was overflying them. A direct hit on his battlemaster almost spelled disaster for the Federated Suns, as their first prince was gravely wounded. He was evacuated back to New Avalon post-haste. Naturally, this crushed the morale of the AFFS on World, but their resolve was hardened by the personal charisma of General Wallace Mickertrick. He rallied his forces and soon got the campaign back on track. His opposite number, Shosho Sakamoto, was doing his best to hold his relatively green forces together while they waited for reinforcements to come, but they were losing ground fast. An opportunity presented itself when he identified Mickertrick's command lance in an isolated position away from the rest of his unit. Leading his own bodyguard lance into the fray, the 2 generals faced off in combat. It was an engagement that neither would walk away from. Yet despite losing both of their commanding officers, the AFFS was able to complete their liberation of Cosa the following year. Unfortunately for Peter Davion, his brilliant success in Operation Roland's Horn was cut short when word of his father's injuries reached him. He was forced to abandon any planned follow-up when he was beckoned back to the capital. Liao managed to win back Baton Katos, but it would be 2 more years before they could muster another raid onto Narellan. For the most part, the front reverted back to its dormant state again. On New Avalon, Joseph Davion was barely holding on. He had sustained life-threatening injuries during the battle for Cosa, and a lethal dose of radiation from his mech's ruptured fusion drive. He abdicated in favour of his son on January 7, 2931, passing away 4 years later. In 2930, the 20-year reign of Primus Kari Marie Marshall came to an end. Her time in office was relatively unremarkable. She had spent the past decade trying to increase support for ComStar out in the Periphery, with only marginal success. For every person who welcomed the organisation with open arms, there was another who distrusted them intensely. Marshall's health had already been in decline when she suffered a fatal stroke in November. Her chosen successor, Precentor New Earth Hollings York, was sworn in by the rest of the First Circuit in due course. His first action as Primus was to schedule a meeting with each of the successor lords to discuss relations between them and reaffirm ComStar's commitment to neutrality. Only one head of state rejected his invitation, Coordinator Hugai Kurita. His reason for doing so was simple. His sister Nesses had just forsaken her family heritage to apply for a place in the ComStar Order. She was a notable coup for the institution, the first Great House scion to enroll since Elizabeth Marik almost 70 years earlier. Hugai had not taken the news well, coming hot on the heels of reports of renewed pirate activity and word of his old mentor Sakamoto's death on Kosa 7. Despite the coordinator's warning not to, Hollings approved Neses's application. York's olive branch to Hugai was a promise that she would remain stationed on Luthien. The new acolyte's first posting was to a hospice on the outskirts of the capital city. A few days later, Neses's bodyguards noticed some unknown individuals trailing her. When confronted, the undercover ISF agents opened fire. 7 people were killed in the ensuing gunfight. Kurita was abducted by the surviving intelligence operatives and brought back to Unity Palace. When Presenter Luthien's Stephanie Hendricks arrived to demand the release of their acolyte, the coordinator accused her of brainwashing his sister. If Rom made any effort to free her from confinement, the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery would retaliate against whatever ComStar stronghold she was moved to. Back on Terra, the Primus was faced with a dilemma. ComStar had always protected its own members in the past, whenever they weren't launching one of their own purges, of course, and they had threatened the successor states with action if they ever did interfere. Though every new acolyte agreed to forego family ties, there was no denying that House Kurita still saw Neses as one of their own. Allowing the kidnapping to go unanswered was intolerable, and so the First Circuit debated on what action to take. Most were in favour of interdiction, but Hollings did not think it would end well. The Freewells League operation had backfired in unexpected ways, and the stubborn Draconis Combine would likely refuse to accept fault in the matter. It was Presenter Dieron William Fullerton who proposed a different solution. He believed that the excessively martial House Kurita would only respond to the threat of military action. William had been one of York's most vocal critics, but the Primus was inclined to agree with him. The problem was that ComStar had no standing army. There were alternatives, however. Through their control of the Mercenary Review Board, they were able to quickly raise a ragtag force of 6 battlemech regiments. They would have little to no cohesion on the field, but their weight in numbers allowed them to overwhelm the defences of any single planet. Reaching Luthien was out of the question, but the Dieron military district was well within reach. Hollings also had to consider the internal political struggles when choosing a course of action. Following Fullerton's plan exactly would give him significant clout within the First Circuit. With this in mind, he chose to distance himself and the ruling precentors from the operation as much as possible, delegating all necessary power to Stephanie Hendricks on Luthien. To provide her with the tools she might need to strike a bargain, ComStar acquired the services of another mercenary battalion, the Bandersnatches, just as their current contract with House Kurita expired. Already deep within the Draconis Combine interior, they began jumping towards the capital. Presenter Luthien, meanwhile, was being stonewalled by the coordinator. She was forced to shut down the hyperpulse generator station for half a day in order to be granted an audience on December 13, 2931. Even then, Stephanie Hendricks was made to wait a further 5 hours before being allowed entry into the throne room. The mood in the Grand Hall was overtly hostile when she finally came before Hugai Kurita. Neither party minced words. The coordinator would not allow Neses to leave Unity Palace, so the presenter played her hand. 6 regiments of mercenaries were on their way into the Draconis Combine with the objective to strike at key installations along the border, opening the realm to further attacks from neighbouring successor states. Stephanie then opened a connection to Colonel Dietrichson of the Bandersnatches aboard the ComStar dropship currently entering atmosphere, requesting that he descend directly on top of their location. Unless she countermanded the order, they were to attack the palace grounds and extricate the captive acolyte by force. Not since Operation Silver Shield back at the start of the First Succession War had ComStar openly undertaken a military action. Hugai was shocked at her brazenness. There was absolutely zero chance that a single battalion could fight their way free from Luthien's combined arsenal, but he also recognized that there was not nearly enough time to scramble his aerospace defenses to intercept the dropship in its final moments. Kurita understood that this was not a survivable situation for him. With no other option on the table, he finally accepted Hendrik's demands. She thanked him for his empathy on the matter, and told Dietrichson to stand down. No word of the incident ever leaked outside of ComStar or the upper echelons of the Draconis Combine. There was no question that this would colour all future proceedings between the two parties, however. The Coordinator and his descendants now fully understood that the modern interpretation of the word of Blake would not see the Sacred Order hesitate to launch an attack that would assuredly lead to their own destruction if that's what protecting their own beliefs called for. The Primus, meanwhile, was jubilant about the success of the operation. He could take partial credit for delegating the necessary powers to Presenter Luthien, and her own fame gave him the opportunity to replace the quarrelsome Presenter Dieron with Stephanie Hendricks as a reward, adding a close ally to the First Circuit. Though the undertaking to free Nesses Kurita had been a success, it had highlighted a certain vulnerability that Hollings wanted to address: their lack of a military. In 2933, he proposed the formation of the ComStar Guards and Militia. Though York's popularity was at an all-time high, his suggestion did seem to fly in the face of Blake's teachings regarding solving disputes without resorting to direct military intervention. Under objections from the other members of the First Circuit, his initial proposal of 8 regiments was scaled back to just 5, consisting exclusively of light infantry. The first inductees into this new force were former mercenaries, the Bandersnatchers. Part of ROM's annual budget was siphoned off in order to provide the necessary funding. New equipment wasn't needed, as ComStar had vast stockpiles of Starleague Defense Force vintage. Their base of operation was to be the former War Triad centerpiece, Great Britain's Sandhurst Military Academy. The public renovation of this ancient complex did not escape the attention of the surrounding successor states. When questioned, the Primus simply stated his new recruits would be reserved purely for the defense of Terra. Why Earth suddenly needed a ComStar garrison now when it had none for the past century and a half, save for regional militias, went unanswered. Since control of Terra didn't factor into any of the Successor Law's short-term goals, they apparently were willing to let the issue slide. There was another more secretive branch of the ComStar Guards and Militia. As far as the successor states were concerned, the last warship had vanished during the 8th Battle of Hesperus in 2857, consigning the monstrously powerful juggernauts to the history books. The truth is far more complex. Back in 2882, work began at Titan shipyards on an enormous Fasline-class yardship. Over the past 50 years, ComStar had used this vessel and others like it to scour the inner sphere for any salvageable hulks and relocate them to a pair of Starleague Navy facilities at Lytton 6828 and Ross 248. Neither of these systems appeared on any navigation maps, though the latter was home to a moderately sized colony world, Terra Liber, the descendants of one of Earth's 21st century slowboat colonies. These hidden bases were also where Jerome Blake had mothballed the few remaining SLN warships back during the First Succession War. There they remained for the time being, as their sudden reappearance would no doubt send shockwaves across known space. But Hollings York ordered repairs to be carried out and crews to be trained. This was no small undertaking, since the required expertise had been lost to even ComStar. As a stopgap measure, the factories at Titan began building heavily automated Dante-class destroyers until others could be brought back into service. Construction began in 2935, with CSV Narbonne launching 6 years later, the first new warship in over a century. Operation Freedom had largely stalled out by the end of its second decade, as evidenced by the LCAF's failure to capture Kimball in 2932. They continued to apply pressure on the Draconis Combine, but fewer worlds were changing hands. In 2937, Archon Tatiana Steiner stepped down in favour of her son Marco. His most pressing duty upon taking to the throne of the Lyran Commonwealth was restoring order to the Rimwood region of his realm. Lohengrin, the LIC's anti-terrorism team, was overburdened trying to combat what felt like an epidemic among the border worlds facing the Free Worlds League. Furthermore, every offensive action they took was easily countered, and every raid against them always struck where the line was weakest. There was no doubt that a spy was passing information to House Marik. Steiner and the LIC Molehunters concocted a plan to uncover the identity of the traitor. They had narrowed it down to just 4 individuals, whom they included in the planning stages of 4 separate raids. Each went ahead later that year. When the results came in, it was clear that their man was Traitor Tertren. Unfortunately, the Lyrans bungled his arrest, and the renegade Hauptmann was able to escape out into the Periphery. But even after he had fled, his influence was still felt by the LCAF in that region. Paranoia was pervasive in all aspects of the military, leading to ever-worsening delays and mistrust between officers. It's possible this played a part in the death of the Archon's brother Errol in 2942, when he was killed in action on the ever-contentious Bella 1. Having achieved most of his ambitions along the Lyran front, Samuel Marik turned his attention spinward. The FWLM didn't have the forces to spare for a major campaign, their last raids back in 2934 ending in defeat, but the Captain General believed he could win a victory by other means. Capellan mercenaries may have caused damage on Park Place in 2940, but the next year, the Free Worlds League would more than even the score. The Sian-Marik branch of the noble line had been living in exile within the Capellan Confederation for over half a millennium. Though Liao had long since supplanted the Sian family within the Jade Palace, they still ruled as administrators of a minor duchy within the Sarna commonalty. In 2941, a safe agent seduced Vincent Sian-Marik and convinced him to turn on the ailing Chancellor. This was a major political coup for the Free Worlds League. 5 systems were added to the realm at the drop of a hat, serving as the foundation for the new Oran and Zion provinces. Unfortunately, the CCAF garrisons stationed on those worlds did not see things the same way. They carried out scorched earth tactics before withdrawing. These were not the only new provinces to emerge within the Free Worlds League over the course of the Third Succession War. Each of the larger power blocks had shared several systems, with a handful of the former Corward worlds from the Grand Duchy of Oriente banding together into the Protectorate. Similarly, the Islamic majority worlds around the Corward end of the Duchy of Andurian broke away to form the Mozaro Archipelago. The two still retain cordial relations, with House Humphreys wielding de facto control over their vote in Parliament. The realm's latest acquisitions from House Steiner also merged into the duchies of Amity, Calasan, Dunne, and Kalidasa. The recent humiliation along the Marik border proved to be the death knell for Chancellor Merlin Liao. In 2942, he died from symptoms that suspiciously had all the hallmarks of radiation poisoning. No one was ever implicated in a crime, perhaps because there was no earnest desire to find the culprit. Regardless, his son Tarlac succeeded him, and immediately had to face the reality that the Capellan Confederation was under siege from all sides. The Seacaf had fought off an invasion of Bethel 2 years earlier, but Davion now returned to raid 2 more planets. The Northwind Highlanders' valiant defense of Xi'an, particularly the actions of Captain Erica Laurel, were celebrated as a turning of the tide, but they barely had a chance to recover before the Freewells League launched their own attack on Xi'an in 2943. In retaliation, the fabled mercenaries went on the offensive, raiding the provincial capital of Oriente. The next year began in much the same way, with raids on Daniels and Epsilon Eridani, but at last there came news that might offer some respite. In 2944, Captain General Samuel Marik passed away. Hugai Kurita had never been able to shake the shame that came with defeat at the hands of ComStar. With each passing year, he became ever more withdrawn from affairs of state, spending many long hours wandering the halls of Unity Palace in isolation. This was having a definite impact on the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery, who began losing ground to Steiner's inexorable Operation Freedom. An attack on Kars in 2944 was turned back, with Davion applying pressure within the Diero military district, first at Styx that year, then at Silene in 2945. 8 years of relentless raids ultimately forced Kurita to abandon the world altogether. On Terra, the Primus was devoting ever more time to getting his pet project off the ground. CSV Bordeaux slipped its moorings in 2944, with the next hull already under construction. The ComStar guards and militia lacked for nothing, as he saw to it that every lavish expense was paid for, often out of their covert operations budget. He received no pushback from Rom, as Presenter Gilbert was a firm believer in the scheme, appointed to the position by Hollings in advance. There were some dissenting voices among the first circuit, chiefly Presenter Oriente Adrian Sims, but he was able to outmaneuver his opponent by naming her as his successor. Any further attacks from Adrian Sims' corner would doubtless be perceived as purely self-serving. York need only have looked back at his own organization's history to see the inherent risks that came with such an action, however. While the Primus may not have wanted to hear it, his actions were having a very real impact on ComStar's intelligence gathering. Numerous agents were picked up by the successor states, most meeting with deeply unpleasant ends. Hollings reacted to their plight with cool indifference. When pressed, he made his dislike of Rom known. Then, in early 2947, he announced that it was his intention to disband them entirely, handing their responsibilities over to the ComStar guards and militia. 2 months later, he travelled to Berkshire, England for a cornerstone laying ceremony. In a symbolic link to their past, the former crown jewel of the Star League era war triad, Sandhurst Military Academy, was being reopened as the headquarters and training centre for the ever-growing ComStar army. While his legion of new recruits looked on, York went up on stage to give his speech, accompanied by Presenter Alpha Centauri and Presenter Rom. There are 2 versions of what happened next. The official story is that one of the guards on perimeter duty, Adept Dodge Courier, turned and opened fire on the Primus. 5 laser blasts were triggered, 3 of which impacted Hollings, the others striking the 2 presenters standing to his sides. Dodge managed to flee in the ensuing chaos, while York was evacuated. Unfortunately, his limo suffered an engine failure, delaying his arrival at hospital for several precious minutes. The Primus's injuries proved fatal. Adrian Sims was confirmed as the new head of ComStar 6 hours later. When the fugitive courier was located, he chose to fight to the end. He too died in hospital shortly after, before any interrogation could take place. Unofficially, As many as 8 shots were fired by at least 2 gunmen. Camera footage clearly shows 6 individual laser traces, and witnesses in the crowd report hearing a total of 8. Dodge's weapon had only been fired 5 times. In the recording, Gilbert was the last to be struck down, but scars around the impact point were indicative of a fully charged laser rifle. Whether a second person was in on the plot, or whether they took an opportunistic potshot at the presenter ROM isn't known. The limousine was given a clean bill of health just 2 days before the suspicious breakdown, and then sent in for repairs a week after the assassination without anyone first checking for sabotage. There are several links between Kurita and the Draconis Combine. His previous tour of duty had been on Pest, during which time he had come into contact with several high-ranking Kuritan officials. Money had been deposited in the Adept's accounts by an unknown source traced back to the successor state. Others believe this was all misinformation planted by Rom, just as his journals were later discovered to be forgeries. Perhaps the final piece of evidence that might point towards a culprit is that just 8 days after her ascendancy, Primus Adrian Sims announced that instead of dismantling ROM, she would restore its funding and broaden their powers, a reward for a job well done. The ComStar guards and militia did manage to survive Adrian's primacy, though certain aspects of it were almost immediately cut. Hollingsyork's dream of a fleet of warships was recognised as the folly that it was. The third and final Dante class, CSV Montpellier, launched in 2948, the last of 6 Faslane class vessels following it out of the Titan shipyards a year later. That marked the end of the short-lived ComStar warship fleet, and indeed the last venture involving such craft anywhere in the Inner Sphere. Presumably, there still exists today a handful of Starleague vintage designs secreted at their ancient berths, but those are most likely in advanced stages of decay. Throughout history, there are moments where all the best laid plans are upended, where strategy and tactics are trumped by what can only be called fate. The Freewells League was about to experience exactly that. It began during a raid on Ingersoll in March 2947, when Paul Maddox's aerospace fighter was shot down, killing the Captain General. His sister Iris replaced him at Atreus. She desired to see her successor state lead the way in recovering lost technology, but just 4 months into her reign, Iris was seriously injured in a road accident. No longer fit to rule, she passed the reins to her son Brock. His first challenge came when Steiner raids against Alula Australis forced him to relocate the planet's vital industry off-world, crippling the local economy. Brock may have had his own priorities, but the young Captain General appointed his mother as one of his chief advisors. For a brief moment, the League benefited from an iron-willed leader committed to winning the war, paired with a champion for unearthing lost tech. It did not last. Just 18 months passed before he too was killed in a bombing raid against Van Diemen IV in December 2948, leaving the throne to his brother Thaddeus. The succession of so many Captains General in such a short span of time understandably threw the Freewells League into chaos. Regrettably for all involved, Thaddeus Marik II proved to be every bit as contentious and divisive among Parliament as his namesake. He wasted little time in drawing up ambitious plans for a major assault into the Federation of Sky, boldly named Operation Killing Stroke. In January 2950, the Captain General confidently presented his stratagem before the MPs, calling on the provinces to redeploy around 30 of their regiments to the Corward border ahead of the assault. Their rejection of his master plan took Thaddeus completely by surprise. Not only did they refuse to approve the $3 billion MBIL budget, they also declared that if Killing Stroke were to go ahead, every system within 2 jumps from the border would be at risk of invasion, and therefore could invoke the Home Defense Act. 12 provinces did exactly that, blocking the FWLM from the use of 18 mech regiments in total. The Captain General was nothing if not obstinate, however, and pressed on regardless. To make up the deficit, Thaddeus hired 10 regiments of mercenaries using the Marik family's personal fortune. To prevent any other planets from withdrawing their support, he ordered federal troops to land on Nestor and Talitha, overthrowing their governments and replacing them with loyal stooges. Seeing this, several others in the Terran corner of the Freewells League came together to form the Ring Coalition, a mutual defense pact that informally united their worlds against both external and internal threats. The Captain General's last attempt to sway people to his side was promising that only those who participated in the campaign would be included in dividing up the spoils. Very few were won over by this argument. Operation Killing Stroke finally commenced 2 years behind schedule, and failed to achieve even a single one of its objectives. Thaddeus Marik's obsession with the Lyran front at last gave the Capellan Confederation a chance to reverse their fortunes. For the first time in a long while, the Chancellor felt able to go on the offensive. Lothar's Fusiliers were sent to strike at Berenson in 2948, then redeployed to the Federated Suns front in order to lead a joint expedition to the planet Lee. 2950 was a busier year, with 2 sorties into Freewells League territory, including a deep raid all the way to Lancaster. While they were away, the Certus Fusiliers were making their own moves. Weekapog held, but the planet Daniels was lost. This rather poor showing would end up being the sum total of Tarlac Liao's accomplishments during his 8-year reign. He died on September 12th, killed by a Maskarovka defector. The Prefectorate quickly approved his eldest daughter Ingrid as the next Chancellor. Despairing at the Capellan Confederation Armed Forces' poor performance in recent years, Liao made it her mission to revitalize the aerospace branch of her military. Her changes were first put to the test in 2952, when the realm yet again came under assault from both of their neighbouring states. The armed forces of the Federated Suns struck at Camel, while the Freewells League military targeted Ingersoll and Leal, the former coming 2 years to the day after the Chancellor's ascendancy. Ingrid's aerospace fighters proved more than a match for the aggressors, encouraging Liao to launch a more ambitious venture. A diversionary raid against Bakum would hopefully pull some of the AFFS away from their primary target, Lee. 3 regiments descended on the world in October, supported by almost 300 aerospace fighters. Ingrid's grand invasion was doomed from the start, however. Both the DMI and MIIO had foreknowledge of the attack, prompting the First Prince to heavily reinforce the garrison on Lee in advance. The equal parts chaotic and colossal dogfight over the planet saw the lighter Capellan craft shot down with relative ease by their heavier Davion counterparts, leading many pilots to refer to the 3-day furball as the Great Lee Turkey Shoot. The Confederation was forced to abandon the invasion after losing 40 aerospace fighters in the opening engagement. The latter years of Marco Steiner's reign were troubled ones. Kurita had nearly succeeded in reconquering Ride in 2950, and then 2 years later, the 3rd Marik Militia took possession of Kavanagh II with such ease it was as if they knew exactly how the garrison would act in advance. The Archon was going through his own private struggle as well. He had been diagnosed with incurable pancreatic cancer, and the drugs he was taking to fight the disease left him severely debilitated, incapable of ruling. For the sake of his young son, he held on until 2952, when he at last felt comfortable abdicating in favour of Giovanni now that he was out of his teenage years. His ascension to the throne coincided with a major victory for the Commonwealth. Their armed forces had spent the past few years preparing for an attack against the heavily defended Farlan. 3 BattleMech regiments and an additional 14 conventional ones descended on the planet and completely overwhelmed the garrison. The Lyran juggernaut steamrolled over anyone that stood in their way. In retaliation, the Combine dispatched a mercenary regiment to raid the capital of Virginiashire in 2953. What started as a minor confrontation soon sucked in every reserve regiment in the vicinity as each side's commander requested ever more reinforcements. Over the next 2 years, around 35 regiments saw action on Alexandria, including 7 BattleMech units, more than matching the contest on Farlan. It was a hard-fought victory for Steiner, and yet another demoralizing loss for the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery. This climactic battle came at the worst time for the DCMS. Hugai Kurita had become almost totally uncommunicative in the final decade of his life. His complete disinterest in events outside the palace walls left his military without sufficient funds to respond to Operation Freedom's relentless approach. It was not the only defeat they would suffer in 2955 either, as the AFFS took advantage of the Coordinator's worsening lethargy by raiding Ludwig. Lyran High Command was trying to resolve how they had been defeated so comprehensively at Kavanagh earlier that decade. The 3rd Merrick Militia was on record as a fairly unexceptional unit, but had spent several years away from the front retraining under a new commander who they believed had an intimate understanding of LCAF doctrine. The Commonwealth signed off on a headhunter mission assigned to the Iridani Light Horse that would specifically target the enemy colonel. The attack took place in 2957 and went off without a hitch. When the mercenaries extracted the deceased officer from his mech, they were shocked to find none other than the traitor Traitor Tertren. Giovanni Steiner, meanwhile, was doing wonders with the realm's economy. Several smart decisions on his part freed up a great deal of funds that he used to restock his military's dwindling supply of replacement parts and basic consumables. His foresight on this matter would prove to be extremely fortuitous. Exactly 100 years had passed since the fabled 6th, 7th and 8th battles of Hesperus. Their victory over the Draconis Combine Admiralty was a source of great nationalistic pride within the Commonwealth. Whatever celebrations might have been planned would have to be put on hold, however, as in 2957, the dragon returned to sink its talons into the hyper-industrial world again. Their plan was as simple as it was desperate. A pair of BattleMech regiments were dropped on a near suicidal trajectory right onto the mountain complexes. Though many smashed against the cliff faces, enough survived to cause untold destruction before the garrison was able to respond to the unorthodox landing and eradicate the threat. After the titanic struggles on Farlan and Alexandria these past 5 years, the 9th Battle of Hesperus should have been little more than an afterthought, yet the impact was far greater. The ancient facilities suffered greater damage than during any prior raid, with overall production halved. It was another 2 decades before they returned to nominal output. Hesperus's reputation as an unassailable fortress had been shattered by the daring assault. There was no question that this would not be the last time this infamous planet would play host to one of the defining moments of the Succession Wars. And that concludes the 4th chapter in the history of the 3rd Succession War. I'm not certain yet, but I believe this is going to be the 4th of 9 chapters on this series. We're well past the halfway mark in terms of timeline, but there are a couple of events that happen towards the end of the conflict that are going to get special attention, so we'll slow down a little bit as we get closer to 3025. next up we're going to cover pretty much the rest of the 30th century up to around 2990. The reason I'm stopping there is because I want the episode after that to look at the rise of the current crop of successor lords circa 3025. The first of those 5 individuals takes power in 2990, and I believe the last of them does so in 3014. A couple other significant faces also show up in that same 15-year period, so we'll look at them too, of course. For this chapter, we were kind of all over the place. A hell of a lot of raiding taking place in the 30th century. That's kind of the defining feature of this point in the history. There were some larger battles, of course, mentioned a couple towards the end there, and we had Operation Roland's Horn earlier on. We have precious little information about it, but I think as far as number of planets seized within a couple year, only the initial invasion right at the start of the war matched it. That's true, of course, only as far as successor state versus another successor state goes. We won't get ahead of ourselves just now, but most of you are already aware, of course, that there is a certain amount of unrest coming in 3014. Lots of fun ComStar stuff in this episode as well. I'm still not sure how I feel about the whole situation on Luthien. It seems a bit far-fetched that the coordinator would just let ComStar get away with it and not just immediately take reprisal action as soon as the crisis was dealt with. But I guess that's just one of those things you gotta take at face value. The more significant development within ComStar as far as future events are concerned was the creation of the ComStar Guards and Militia, later known as the ComGuards. Couldn't find a source for when exactly the name changed between the two. Seems like it was just a colloquial term at first, and then it was just later adopted officially. There was one aspect of that I wasn't sure if I wanted to include or not, and that was the existence of the ComStar warship fleet. Now, of course, I have mentioned them before in the past when we've been discussing warships, the surviving warships, back in the Second Succession War. But at the time I kind of left it as we're not really sure where they are or what's happening with them. Ultimately I decided to include them in this chapter, but I did try to put one final nail in the coffin, so to speak, at the very end of that section by saying that ComStar was basically finding it impossible to bring them back into service, and ultimately it was way more trouble than it was worth, and they've just been neglected ever since. It does raise the question of where am I getting all this information? Nobody in 3025 knows about the existence of these things, save, of course, for the skeleton crews that operate those hidden bases within ComStar. I don't even know if the First Circuit knows about those hidden Starleague bases, and about that slowboat colony world. I think they're rediscovered by the Terran hegemony back in James McKenna's day. This does kind of link back into the history of the Terran Alliance we covered recently. Anyway, let's wrap this thing up. Thank you each and every one of you for all your continued support, for every comment you leave on the video, for every like you give it, for every time you share it around with somebody else. Every bit of that helps me tremendously, and I really do appreciate it. As ever, if you've got questions, feel free to ask them. I try to respond to as many people as I can in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, subscribe to the channel. If you want to get early access to them, you can check out my Patreon, it's linked in the description. I try to post things over there as soon as I'm done making them, regardless of how far away the premiere is going to be on YouTube. And I'll mention now that because I'm away on holiday at the end of September, there's a good chance there might not be a video early October time, until I can get back into the swing of things, depending on when this one comes out. But whenever it does come, I hope that I will see you guys there for the 5th chapter in the Third Succession War.